I watched Marcus check his Rolex for the third time in 10 minutes, his jaw tightening as he scanned the entrance of Lumiere, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, where he'd proposed to my sister exactly 6 months after my funeral in my previous life. The maitre d' approached him with that particular expression of professional pity reserved for people who've been stood up, and I felt something warm and vicious bloom in my chest as I sipped champagne from my penthouse balcony 3 blocks away. Through the window of my high-rise apartment, I could see the restaurant's glittering facade, and I knew, with the crystal-clear certainty that came from having lived this night before, that he would wait exactly 47 minutes before calling. Then another 20 before leaving. Then he would show up at my apartment prepared to gaslight me into thinking I'd gotten the date wrong, that I was forgetful, unstable, just like he'd spent 3 years convincing me I was. But I wasn't there anymore. I wasn't anywhere he expected me to be. My phone buzzed. Right on schedule. I declined the call and poured myself another glass of Dom Perignon, the 2008 vintage he'd always said was wasted on someone with my unsophisticated palate. Funny how much better it tasted when you weren't desperately trying to please someone who had never intended to show up for you in the first place. The night I died, I'd waited at this same restaurant for 3 hours. It was supposed to be our engagement dinner, the one he'd finally agreed to after I'd landed the Chen Industries account that had saved my family's failing company. Mother had been so proud for once. Even my sister Vanessa had hugged me, tears in her eyes as she'd helped me pick out the perfect dress. Marcus had texted that he was running late, stuck in traffic. So sorry, order without him. He'd be there soon. I'd ordered. I'd waited. I'd made excuses to the increasingly uncomfortable waitstaff. I'd called him 17 times. He never came. Instead, I'd left the restaurant after midnight, humiliated and heartbroken, and stepped into the street without looking. The car came out of nowhere. At least, that's what the police report said. What I remembered in those final crystalline moments was the driver's face. My own sister behind the wheel, her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite shock. More like frustration. Like she'd been aiming for something and missed. Then nothing. Then everything. I'd woken up 3 years earlier, the morning after my 23rd birthday, in my old cramped apartment with its water-stained ceiling and broken heating. At first, I thought it was a dream. Then, I thought I'd gone insane. It took me approximately 4 hours of compulsive Googling, checking dates, and hyperventilating into a paper bag to accept the impossible truth. I had somehow been given a second chance. I had died at 26, and now I was 23 again. And I remembered everything, every betrayal, every manipulation, every carefully orchestrated moment of my destruction. But this time, I knew the script. This time, I could rewrite the ending. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of careful planning, strategic moves, and watching the people who'd destroyed me walk blindly into the trap I'd been setting since the moment I opened my eyes in my past. And tonight was just the beginning of their reckoning. Understanding what had happened to me required understanding what my life had been. Or rather, what it had been designed to be by the people who should have loved me. My father, Richard Hartley, had built Hartley Innovations from nothing. He was a self-made man who believed in merit, hard work, and the fundamental principle that family came first. He'd always said he wanted to leave his empire to the daughter who proved herself worthy of carrying the Hartley name into the future. I had worshipped him. My mother, Patricia, was a former beauty queen who'd married up and never let anyone forget it. She was elegant, poised, and utterly devoted to maintaining the family's social standing. She threw the best charity galas, knew everyone worth knowing, and had raised 2 daughters to understand that in our world, appearance was everything. My sister Vanessa was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she could walk, she'd been the golden child. Where I was bookish and awkward, she was charismatic and social. Where I struggled with social anxiety, she commanded every room she entered. Where I buried myself in business textbooks and coding tutorials, she mastered the art of making powerful people fall in love with her. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that Father valued substance over style, that my technical skills and business acumen would prove my worth. I told myself that hard work would be enough. I was catastrophically wrong. In my previous life, I'd spent my early 20s working 60-hour weeks at Hartley Innovations. I'd started in the mailroom, Father's idea to teach me the business from the ground up, and I'd clawed my way through every department. I learned supply chain management, product development, financial analysis, and client relations. I stayed late, came in early, and poured every ounce of my energy into proving myself. Vanessa, meanwhile, had skipped college entirely to find herself in Europe, funded by mother's personal account. She had returned with a French accent, a wardrobe full of designer clothes, and absolutely no interest in the family business. Father had loved her for it. "Vanessa knows how to live," he'd say, watching her regale dinner parties with stories of her adventures. "You could learn something from her, Claire. Life isn't just about spreadsheets." But it was mother who'd done the real damage. I realized it slowly, painfully, over years of small cruelties that I'd initially dismissed as tough love. She'd critique my appearance at family dinners. "Claire, darling, that dress makes you look washed out. Why don't you wear something colorful like Vanessa?" While simultaneously sabotaging my efforts to improve. The personal shopper she'd hired for me had somehow only selected clothes that were unflattering and outdated. The hairstylist she'd recommended had given me a disastrous cut that took months to grow out. The nutritionist she'd insisted I see had put me on a restrictive diet that left me exhausted and unable to focus. Every attempt I made to match Vanessa's effortless grace was met with a combination of criticism and subtle undermining that left me feeling more inadequate than before. It was Marcus who'd seemed like salvation. I'd met him at a corporate mixer when I was 23. This would have been just a few weeks from now in this new timeline. He was older, successful, charming, in a way that made me feel chosen. He worked in venture capital and seemed genuinely interested in my ideas about the company. He'd listened when I talked about my innovations, encouraged my ambitions, and told me I was brilliant. For the first time in my life, I'd felt seen. We'd dated for 3 years. 3 years during which I'd slowly, systematically lost myself. It started small. He'd suggest I skip family dinners to work on projects with him, isolating me from what little support I had. He'd critique my clothes, my hair, my laugh, always gently, always framed as concern. "I just want you to be your best self, Claire. You're so talented, but you don't know how to present yourself." He'd encouraged me to pour myself into work, to take on the most challenging projects, the most demanding clients. "You need to prove yourself," he'd say. "Your father needs to see you're not just competent, but exceptional." I'd worked myself to exhaustion trying to meet standards that kept shifting just out of reach. And through it all, he'd been subtly, carefully, systematically stealing from me. The first time I'd developed a major innovation, a proprietary algorithm that could optimize supply chains in real time, I'd shared everything with Marcus. He'd been so excited, so supportive. He'd helped me refine the pitch, encouraged me to present it to Father. 2 weeks before my presentation, Marcus had needed space to figure things out. We'd taken a break. I'd been devastated, but had thrown myself into work. 3 weeks later, Marcus had reconciled with me, apologetic and loving. And 6 months after that, his firm had launched a nearly identical product. When I'd confronted him, he'd been bewildered, hurt that I'd accuse him of something so awful. "Claire, these things happen in tech. Great minds think alike. Are you really going to let paranoia destroy what we have?" I'd believed him. God help me. I'd believed him. It happened again. And again. Every major project I worked on seemed to find its way to Marcus's firm or their clients, always just different enough to avoid legal action, always perfectly timed to beat me to market. My father had been disappointed. "You have good ideas, Claire, but you lack execution. You're not fast enough, not decisive enough. Vanessa would have moved quicker." Vanessa, who by this point had been appointed vice president of public relations, despite never having worked a day in her life, had been sympathetic. "It's so hard being the smart one," she'd say, patting my hand. "Everyone expects so much more from you." The final betrayal had been the Chen Industries account. Chen Industries was a massive Chinese manufacturing conglomerate looking to expand into Western markets. Landing them as a client would have been a game changer for Hartley Innovations, a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars over 5 years. Father had put out a company-wide competition. Whoever brought in Chen Industries would be appointed COO, the heir apparent to eventually take over the company. I'd spent 6 months cultivating a relationship with Chen's leadership team. I'd learned Mandarin, studied Chinese business culture, and developed a comprehensive partnership proposal that addressed every one of their needs. I'd worked 16-hour days, sacrificing sleep, health, and what remained of my social life. Marcus had been supportive, as always. He'd helped me practice my presentations, reviewed my proposals, and celebrated each small victory with me. The night before my final presentation to Mr. Chen, Marcus had taken me to dinner. He'd ordered champagne, told me he loved me, and said that once I closed this deal and became COO, we should finally get married. I'd been floating on air. I'd woken up the next morning with the worst flu of my life, or so I'd thought. I was vomiting, feverish, barely able to stand. Marcus had insisted I stay home, promising to call the office and reschedule my presentation. He'd lied. The presentation had happened on schedule, only it hadn't been my presentation. Vanessa had delivered it, my proposal, my research, my carefully cultivated relationships. And she'd done it flawlessly. Mr. Chen had been charmed. Father had been thrilled. The contract had been signed. Vanessa had been named COO, and I'd been confined to bed for 3 days with what the doctor later told me was severe food poisoning, probably from contaminated shellfish. Funny how Marcus had ordered for both of us that night, how he'd insisted I try the oysters he'd specially selected. By the time I'd recovered enough to confront anyone, it was over. Vanessa was the golden child triumphant. Father had patted my shoulder and told me I'd have other opportunities, that I should be proud of my sister. Mother had suggested I take some time off, maybe travel with Vanessa to learn from her. Marcus had been sympathetic, had suggested we postpone engagement plans until I was in a better headspace. I'd spiraled, depression, anxiety, and a creeping certainty that I'd been systematically destroyed by the people I loved most. But I had no proof, and voicing my suspicions only made me sound paranoid and bitter. That's when Marcus had suggested the engagement dinner, a fresh start, a celebration of our love separate from family drama. He'd book Lumiere, we'd have a perfect evening, and he'd finally propose. I'd been so desperate to believe in something good that I'd ignored every red flag. He'd stood me up. And when I'd left the restaurant, heartbroken and humiliated, my sister had been waiting in her car, ready to tie up the last loose end in whatever plot they'd all been weaving. I'd died believing I was worthless, paranoid, and unloved. But death had given me clarity, and rebirth had given me power. The decision to fight back hadn't been immediate. For the first few days after waking up 3 years in the past, I'd been paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of my situation. I'd spent hours staring at my younger face in the mirror, touching the features I'd forgotten. The way my cheekbones had been sharper before years of stress eating and emotional neglect. The brightness in my eyes before Marcus had dimmed it with constant criticism. I'd tested my memories obsessively, cross-referencing them with news articles and social media posts. Every detail matched perfectly. I knew who would win the Super Bowl, which stocks would soar, which companies would collapse. I knew, with perfect clarity, exactly how the next 3 years would unfold if I did nothing, and I knew that if I followed the same path, I would end up dead in an intersection at 26. A cautionary tale of a woman who couldn't handle the pressure of her own inadequacy. The turning point came on the 3rd day when I received a text from Marcus. We weren't dating yet in this timeline. We hadn't even met. But I had his number saved from my previous life, and apparently, so did he have mine. The message was simple. Hey, Claire, heard from a mutual friend you might be interested in tech investments. Want to grab coffee? There was no mutual friend. I remembered now. He'd gotten my number from Vanessa, who'd gotten it from Mother's contacts list. This was the beginning of the carefully orchestrated chance meeting that would start our relationship. Staring at that text, I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. They'd planned this. All of it. Marcus hadn't been a boyfriend who'd turned out to be terrible. He'd been planted from the beginning. A weapon aimed at me by my own family, designed to steal my work, undermine my confidence, and ultimately remove me from the line of succession. The question was, why? I'd spent the next week investigating my own family with the detached curiosity of a stranger. What I discovered made me physically ill. Father's will, which I'd never seen in my previous life, was actually quite straightforward. The company would go to whichever daughter demonstrated the greatest business acumen and leadership by the age of 30. Until then, he maintained control, with his COO position serving as a public declaration of his chosen heir. But there was a caveat I'd never known about. If one daughter died before the age of 30 without heirs, her half of the inheritance would automatically transfer to the surviving daughter, who would inherit everything upon father's death. Mother hadn't just wanted Vanessa to succeed, she'd wanted me gone. And she'd spent years engineering exactly that outcome, and the evidence was everywhere once I knew to look for it. Mother's financial records, which I accessed using passwords I remembered from my previous life, showed regular payments to Marcus's consulting firm, starting 6 months before we'd met. There were emails between Mother and Vanessa discussing the Claire problem and how Marcus is handling it perfectly. There were text messages about the poisoning, though they'd been clever enough not to be explicit. Just Vanessa texting Mother, "Shellfish worked perfectly, she won't make the presentation." And Mother's response, "Good, I'll make sure Vanessa is ready." But the most damning evidence was the life insurance policy Mother had taken out on me 2 years before my death. A policy worth $10 million, with Vanessa as the sole beneficiary. They hadn't just wanted me to fail, they'd wanted me dead, and they'd been willing to make it happen. Sitting in my cramped apartment with printouts of evidence spread across my floor, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't just avoid my fate, I would reverse it entirely. I would take everything they'd schemed to steal from me and use it to destroy them instead. But I would be smart about it, patient, strategic. I would give them enough rope to hang themselves, and then I would pull it tight. Phase 1 was simple: become invisible. In my previous life, I'd been so desperate for approval that I'd worn my ambitions openly, making myself an obvious target. This time, I would be different. I would appear to shrink, to doubt myself, to need guidance. I would become the perfect victim. And while they congratulated themselves on crushing my spirit, I would be building an empire they couldn't see. I'd started with money. Using my knowledge of the stock market, cryptocurrency trends, and upcoming corporate mergers, I'd taken my meager savings and invested strategically. A few thousand here, a perfectly timed short there, and within 3 months, I'd turned $12,000 into $300,000. I'd been careful to keep it hidden. Offshore accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, shell companies registered in Delaware. Nothing that could be traced back to me, nothing my family could steal or sabotage. By month 6, I had $2 million. By month 8, now, I had $15 million. But money was just the beginning. What I really needed was power, and power in my world came from relationships and information. I'd reached out to every contact I'd cultivated in my previous life, but earlier, before they'd learned to distrust me. Before Mother and Vanessa had poisoned those relationships. I'd rekindled friendships with people who had become important executives, investors, and power brokers. I'd invested in startups I knew would succeed, making myself a valued angel investor. I'd started a consulting business under a pseudonym, helping companies solve problems I'd already seen them face in my previous timeline. I'd built a network of people who owed me favors, trusted my judgment, and most importantly, had no connection to my family whatsoever. And I'd prepared for tonight. In my previous life, Marcus and I had been dating for 3 months by this point. We would have had our first serious fight next week, manufactured by him to test my boundaries. And I would have apologized desperately, cementing the dynamic that would define our relationship. But in this timeline, I'd been responding to his messages with polite but distant interest. I'd canceled our first coffee date due to a work emergency. I'd been too busy for the dinner he'd suggested. I'd kept him at arm's length, watching him grow increasingly frustrated as his carefully laid plans failed to materialize. Until 2 weeks ago, when I'd finally agreed to a date. He'd been so relieved, so eager. We'd had dinner, and it had been eerily like falling back into a nightmare I'd thought I'd escaped. He'd said all the same things, used all the same tactics, asked all the same probing questions about my work and family. I'd played along perfectly, pretending to be flattered, vulnerable, eager for his attention. And when he'd suggested we have dinner tonight at Lumiere, the same restaurant where he'd stand me up for our engagement dinner 3 years from now, I'd agreed enthusiastically. I'd even confirmed this morning, texting him how excited I was, how I'd been looking forward to this all week. then I'd simply never shown up. No call, no text, no explanation. I'd left him waiting the way he'd left me waiting, and every minute that ticked by was a small, perfect revenge. My phone rang again. Marcus. I declined it and took another sip of champagne, watching the restaurant entrance through my window. Even from this distance, I could see him pacing near the entrance, his phone pressed to his ear. But this wasn't really about Marcus. He was just a symptom of the disease, a tool that my family had used. The real revenge would be much more complex, much more devastating. And it started tomorrow. Tomorrow, I would attend the company-wide meeting where Father would announce the competition for the COO position, the same competition I'd lost in my previous life. Only this time, I wouldn't be competing for the Chen Industries account. I already knew that Vanessa would steal it, and I had no intention of letting her have access to my work again. This time, I would be pursuing a different prize entirely. In my previous life, while I'd been obsessing over Chen Industries, a smaller opportunity had gone almost unnoticed. A struggling Japanese technology firm called Tanaka Robotics. They'd been looking for a Western partner to help them break into American markets, but they'd been dismissed as too small, too risky, too unfamiliar. In my previous timeline, they'd been acquired by a German conglomerate 6 months after my death. Under new management, they'd revolutionized industrial automation and become one of the most valuable tech companies in the world. But that acquisition hadn't happened yet. Tanaka Robotics was still struggling, still looking for a partner, still available. And I was going to get them. I'd spent the last 3 months learning Japanese, studying their technology and making quiet overtures through intermediaries. I'd used my pseudonymous consulting company to provide them with free market analysis that had proven uncannily accurate. I'd built trust and demonstrated value without ever revealing my connection to Hartley Innovations. Tomorrow, I would pitch Father on pursuing Tanaka Robotics. I would present it as a modest opportunity, something appropriate for my limited abilities. I would downplay its potential while knowing exactly how valuable it would become. Vanessa would ignore it completely, focused on the glamorous Chen Industries deal. Mother would encourage her, just as she had before, and I would close the Tanaka deal, bringing in a partnership that would seem modest at first, but would ultimately be worth billions. But that was just the first move. The real brilliance of my plan was its layers. While Vanessa was busy stealing Chen Industries, and yes, I would let her steal it, I would even help her do it, I would be quietly documenting every step of her theft. Every email she accessed without authorization, every file she copied, every conversation she recorded without my knowledge. I would let her think she was succeeding while I built an ironclad case against her. And Mother? Oh, Mother's downfall would be even sweeter. I'd already hired a forensic accountant, using my pseudonymous identity, to audit Mother's charitable foundation. The foundation she'd used to launder money, evade taxes, and pay off people like Marcus. The foundation that was about to become the center of a massive IRS investigation. I'd planted the seeds 3 months ago with an anonymous tip. The audit would begin in 2 weeks. And when it did, they would find years of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion, all meticulously documented in records I'd already copied and secured. But I wouldn't be the one to destroy them. I would let them destroy themselves, while I watched from a position of unassailable success. The game had already begun. They just didn't know they were playing it. My phone buzzed with a text. "Marcus, where are you? Are you okay? I'm really worried." I smiled and typed back, "OMG, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot we had plans tonight. I've been so swamped with work. Can we reschedule?" The gaslighting he'd perfected on me turned back on him. Beautiful. His response came quickly. "You forgot? Claire, I confirmed with you this morning." "Did you? I don't remember that. Are you sure you have the right date? I've been so scattered lately." I could imagine his frustration, his confusion. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I was supposed to be desperate for his approval, malleable, easy to control. "Never mind," he texted back. "Let's just reschedule, but Claire, you seem really stressed. Maybe we should talk about it?" There it was, the hook, the concern, the beginning of his campaign to convince me I was unstable and needed him. "You're right," I replied. "I have been stressed. Maybe we should take a break. I don't want to waste your time when I'm such a mess." The pause before his response was longer this time. He was recalculating, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. "Let's not make any rash decisions," he wrote finally. "Why don't we meet for coffee later this week? Something casual." "Maybe," I responded. "I'll let you know. I need to focus on work right now." I silenced my phone and stood, stretching. Below, I could see Marcus finally leaving the restaurant, his shoulders tense with frustration. Tomorrow would be interesting. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, I had one more task. I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted file I'd been building for months. Inside were detailed dossiers on everyone who'd played a role in my previous life's destruction. Marcus, Vanessa, Mother, and a dozen others, friends who'd betrayed me, colleagues who'd stolen from me, mentors who'd sabotaged me. I knew their secrets now. I knew their weaknesses. I knew exactly what would destroy each of them, and over the next 3 years, I would systematically dismantle every single one of their lives just as they had dismantled mine. But I would be patient. I would be thorough. I would make it look like natural consequences, like karmic justice, like anything except what it really was. Carefully orchestrated revenge by someone they'd underestimated so badly that they'd forgotten she existed. I added tonight's interactions to Marcus's file, documenting his attempts at manipulation, his frustration, his confusion. Evidence I might need later, ammunition I was stockpiling. Then I closed the laptop and looked out at the city lights. In my previous life, I died in this city, broken and alone, believing I deserved my fate. In this life, I would own it, and everyone who tried to destroy me would learn the most important lesson I'd learned in death. Never underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose, except I had everything to gain. The conference room at Hartley Innovations was exactly as I remembered it, imposing mahogany table, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Father sat at the head of the table, distinguished and commanding in his custom suit. Mother sat to his right, perfectly coiffed and radiating controlled elegance. Vanessa lounged in her chair across from me, looking effortlessly beautiful in a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. Professional but not flashy, competent but not threatening. The invisible woman just as I'd been before. The rest of the executive team filed in. James Chen, our CFO, no relation to Chen Industries. Sarah Martinez, head of operations. David Park, chief technology officer, and a half-dozen other senior managers. 20 people total, all waiting to hear Father's announcement. I knew what was coming. I'd lived this meeting before. Father stood, commanding immediate attention. "Thank you all for being here. As you know, Hartley Innovations has been my life's work. Building this company from a garage startup to a Fortune 500 enterprise has been the greatest privilege of my life." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But I'm not getting any younger, and it's time to start thinking about succession. I want Hartley Innovations to remain a family company, led by someone who understands both our values and our vision." I watched Vanessa straighten in her chair, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. She knew what was coming too, though for different reasons. To that end, I'm announcing a competition. Over the next 6 months, I want to see which of my daughters can bring the most value to this company. The winner will be appointed Chief Operating Officer and positioned to eventually take over as CEO. He looked between Vanessa and me. The metric is simple. Bring in the most impactful client partnership. Not just in terms of revenue, though that matters, but in terms of strategic value, cultural fit, and long-term potential. This was different from my previous life. Before, he'd specified Chen Industries explicitly. This was broader, more open-ended. Had something changed? Or had I misremembered? No, I remembered everything with perfect clarity. This was exactly what he'd said. I'd just been so focused on Chen Industries, because Marcus had been steering me toward it, that I'd tuned out the actual parameters. "Claire," Father said, turning to me, "I know you've been working hard in the product development department. This is your chance to show what you can do on a larger scale." His tone was encouraging, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't think I could do it. He'd already decided Vanessa would win. "Vanessa," he continued, "I know business isn't your passion, but you have a gift for connecting with people. Use it." Vanessa smiled sweetly. I won't let you down, Daddy. I wanted to vomit. Instead, I smiled softly and said, Thank you for this opportunity, Father. I'll do my best. Weak. Grateful. Exactly what they expected. The meeting continued with logistics and timelines, but I barely listened. I was too busy watching Mother and Vanessa exchange a quick glance, a microscopic smile. They thought they'd already won. After the meeting, as everyone filed out, Vanessa approached me, her expression sympathetic. Claire, I hope this doesn't make things weird between us. I know you work so hard, and I'd hate for this competition to damage our relationship. In my previous life, I'd believed her. I'd told her she was my sister before anything else, and I'd meant it. Now I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was already positioning herself as the gracious victor. Of course not, I said warmly. May the best woman win. That's so sweet of you, she said, touching my arm. And hey, if you ever need advice or want to brainstorm, I'm here for you. The offer to help me so she could steal my ideas, like clockwork. That means a lot, I said, and I watched her satisfaction bloom. As I headed back to my cubicle, yes, I still worked in a cubicle while Vanessa had a corner office, I felt my phone buzz. A text from an unknown number. Package delivered. I smiled. The package was a complete dossier on Tanaka Robotics, compiled by my consulting company, delivered to my apartment. Everything I needed to make my pitch to Father, all sourced from my pseudonymous identity so there was no trail connecting it to me, but I wouldn't pitch immediately. First, I needed to let Vanessa make her move. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Vanessa called an informal meeting with me, claiming she wanted to brainstorm partnership opportunities. We met at a trendy cafe near the office, the kind of place she loved and I'd always felt uncomfortable in. So, she said, stirring her overpriced latte, have you thought about which clients you want to pursue? A few ideas, I said vaguely. Nothing concrete yet. What about you? She leaned forward conspiratorially. Okay, don't tell anyone yet, but I've been researching Chen Industries. You know, the Chinese manufacturing giant? They're looking for a Western partner. She said it like she'd discovered something secret, like she hadn't been directed to this target by Mother and Marcus. That sounds ambitious, I said, letting doubt creep into my voice. Aren't they way out of our league? That's what everyone thinks, Vanessa said, her eyes bright with excitement. But I've been studying their business model, and I think we're actually a perfect fit. Plus, I have some connections through Mother's charity work. I think I can get an introduction. Every word out of her mouth was a lie. She hadn't studied anything. Mother had prepared everything for her, just like last time. Wow, I said, trying to sound impressed and intimidated. That's really impressive, Vanessa. I don't think I could pull off something that big. Hey, don't sell yourself short, she said, the concerned sister. What were you thinking of pursuing? Here was the moment. Would I tell her about Tanaka Robotics? Would I give her something to steal? In my previous life, I would have. I would have shared everything, desperate for her approval and advice. Now, I knew better. Honestly, I'm not sure yet, I said. Maybe some smaller local companies? I don't want to aim too high and embarrass myself. I watched her try to hide her relief and satisfaction. Perfect. She thought I'd already given up. Whatever you decide, I'm sure it'll be great, she said, clearly meaning the opposite. We chatted for another half hour, and I let her subtly interrogate me about my work, my projects, my ideas. I fed her nothing useful, just vague pleasantries and self-deprecating comments that reinforced her image of me as a non-threat. When we parted, she hugged me and told me she loved me. I told her I loved her too. We were both lying. That evening, I visited Father at his home office. Mother was out at one of her charity events, probably meeting with Marcus to coordinate the next phase of their plan. Claire, Father said, looking up from his papers with surprise. What brings you by? I wanted to talk to you about the competition, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. I've been doing some research, and I think I've found an opportunity. His expression was patient, but not particularly interested. Go on. Tanaka Robotics, I said. They're a Japanese firm specializing in industrial automation. They're looking for a Western partner to help them expand into American markets. Father frowned. I'm not familiar with them. How large are they? Revenue-wise, they're relatively small, about 50 million annually. But their technology is revolutionary, and they're positioned for explosive growth with the right partner. 50 million? Father's skepticism was clear. Claire, I was hoping you'd aim for something more substantial. This was exactly what I'd expected. I pulled out a folder, a physical copy of the dossier I'd received, and handed it to him. I understand it seems modest, but look at their technology patents, their efficiency metrics, and their growth trajectory. They're undervalued because they lack market access, not because they lack potential. Father flipped through the folder, his expression shifting from skeptical to intrigued. This is thorough research, he said. Where did you get all this? I've been working on it for a while, I said, which was technically true. I think this could be a game changer for our manufacturing division. He was silent for a long moment, studying the documents. I could see him calculating, weighing, considering. It's an interesting opportunity, he said finally, but it's also risky. Japanese business culture is complex, and without the right connections, this could go nowhere. I know, I said. That's why I've already started building a relationship with them. I've been providing some market analysis through a consulting firm, and they've expressed interest in Hartley Innovations as a potential partner. That got his attention. You've already made contact? Informally, I said. I didn't want to commit the company without your approval, but I've laid the groundwork. Father leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I'd never seen before. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. This is good work, Claire, he said. Genuinely good work. I'm impressed. The words I'd wanted to hear my entire life. They should have meant everything. Instead, I felt nothing but cold determination. Thank you, I said. I won't let you down. I know Vanessa is pursuing Chen Industries, Father said. That's a much larger prize in terms of immediate revenue. I understand, I said. But I think Tanaka has better long-term potential, even if it's less flashy. Father nodded slowly. All right, you have my approval to pursue this. Keep me updated on your progress. As I left his office, I allowed myself a small smile. Phase 2, complete. Now came the hard part, actually closing the Tanaka deal while simultaneously setting the trap for Vanessa's spectacular downfall. But I had 3 months before the Chen presentation. 3 months to build my victory and prepare her destruction. 3 months to show everyone exactly what I was capable of when I wasn't being systematically undermined. The old Claire would have been terrified of failing. The new Claire knew she'd already won. The next 2 months passed in a blur of strategic moves and careful positioning. I traveled to Tokyo 3 times, building relationships with Tanaka's leadership team. I learned their concerns, their goals, their hopes for expansion. I presented them with detailed market analysis, strategic plans, and partnership structures that addressed every one of their needs. I did it all while maintaining my cover as the struggling, insecure daughter trying her best. At the office, I kept my head down, worked my regular job, and gave no indication that I was closing a deal that would ultimately be worth billions. When colleagues asked about my progress in the competition, I gave vague, self-deprecating answers that made them pity me. Meanwhile, Vanessa was making a spectacle of her Chen Industries pursuit. She hosted lavish dinners, flew to Beijing twice, and kept the entire office updated on her progress. Mother bragged about her at every opportunity, positioning Vanessa as the obvious winner, and I let them. I encouraged it even. When Vanessa asked for my input on her presentations, ostensibly to help me learn, actually to see if I had anything worth stealing, I gave her generic advice that made me seem supportive but useless. I was the perfect invisible woman, exactly as I'd been before. Except this time, I was watching them incriminate themselves. The beauty of having lived through this before was knowing exactly what they would do and when they would do it. I knew Vanessa would try to access my work files 3 weeks before the final presentation. I knew Marcus would attempt to install spyware on my laptop during a casual coffee meeting. I knew Mother would try to sabotage my Tokyo travel arrangements. So I prepared for all of it. I set up my laptop to document every unauthorized access, every file copy, every keylogger installation. I created fake files filled with plausible but useless information for them to steal. I made backup travel arrangements through my pseudonymous company, so When my original flights mysteriously got canceled, I already had alternatives. I documented everything, every attempt at sabotage, every theft, every manipulation. I was building a case so ironclad that when I finally pulled the trigger, there would be no escape for any of them. But the most satisfying part was watching my real progress with Tanaka while they remained completely oblivious. By week 6, I had a preliminary agreement in principle. By week 8, I'd negotiated terms that would give Hartley Innovations exclusive distribution rights in North America. By week 10, I'd structured a partnership that would start small but scale into billions over the next decade. And nobody in my family had any idea. The only complication was Marcus. He'd been trying to reconnect with me for weeks, clearly frustrated that his usual tactics weren't working. I'd been stringing him along with occasional coffee meetings where I played the perfect target, vulnerable, lonely, eager for his attention. During these meetings, I'd feed him carefully crafted misinformation about my work. I told him I was struggling with Tanaka, that the cultural barriers were too difficult, that I was thinking of giving up. I made myself seem like such a sure failure that he'd stopped trying to steal my work and had instead focused on reinforcing my self-doubt. It was almost too easy. "You know," he said during one coffee meeting, his hand covering mine across the table, "there's no shame in admitting something is beyond your capabilities. Your father would understand if you withdrew from the competition." "Maybe you're right," I said, letting my voice waver. I wanted to prove myself, you know?" "I know," he said, his thumb stroking my hand in what he thought was a comforting gesture. "But sometimes the bravest thing is knowing your limitations." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to throw my coffee in his face and tell him exactly what I knew, exactly what he was. Instead, I squeezed his hand and said, "You're probably right. I'll think about it." That night, I added our conversation to his dossier. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the attempts to make me quit, all documented, all timestamped, all saved in multiple encrypted locations. The week before the final presentation, Vanessa invited me to lunch. She'd been avoiding me for the past month, too busy with her important work. So I knew this was significant. We met at her favorite restaurant, the kind of place where entrees cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She looked radiant, confident, like someone who'd already won. "Claire," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "I wanted to talk to you before the presentation." "Okay," I said cautiously. "I know how hard you've been working on the Tanaka thing," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "And I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the competition, you should be proud of yourself." The subtext was clear. She expected me to fail, and she was preemptively positioning herself as the supportive sister. "That's sweet of you," I said. "I also wanted to give you some advice," she continued. "Father values confidence and decisiveness. When you present, you need to own the room, not apologize for being there." This was rich coming from someone who'd never worked a real day in her life. But I nodded appreciatively. "Thanks, Vanessa. That's really helpful." "And Claire," she said, leaning forward, "if things don't work out, there's no shame in it. You can always work under me when I'm COO. I'll make sure you have a good position." There it was. The offer of a subordinate role, made to sound generous, designed to make me grateful for scraps. In my previous life, I would have been touched by her magnanimity. I would have thanked her profusely. Now I just smiled and said, "That's really kind of you. Let's see how things go first." After lunch, I went back to my apartment and pulled up the email I'd drafted weeks ago. It was addressed to the board of directors, detailed every instance of corporate espionage and theft I'd documented, and included enough evidence to launch a full investigation, but I didn't send it, not yet. First, I would let them celebrate their victory. Then, I would destroy them. The presentation day arrived crisp and clear. Vanessa went first, delivering a polished pitch about the Chen Industries partnership. She'd clearly had professional help. Probably Mother had hired a presentation coach, and she commanded the room with practiced ease. Her numbers were impressive: a $500 million contract over 5 years, access to Chinese manufacturing, significant revenue growth. The board members nodded approvingly. Father beamed with pride. Mother dabbed at her eyes as if overwhelmed with emotion. When Vanessa finished, there was genuine applause. Then it was my turn. I stood at the front of the conference room, my hands trembling slightly. not from nerves, but from the effort of containing my rage and satisfaction. "Thank you all for being here," I said, my voice quieter than Vanessa's, less polished. "I know my presentation won't be as flashy as my sister's, but I hope you'll see the value in what I'm proposing." I clicked to my first slide, the Tanaka Robotics logo. Tanaka Robotics is a Japanese industrial automation firm. Currently, they generate $50 million in annual revenue, which I know seems modest compared to the Chen deal. I paused, meeting Father's eyes. But what Tanaka offers isn't just a contract. It's a transformation of our entire manufacturing division. For the next 30 minutes, I walked them through everything. The technology, the patents, the efficiency gains, the scalability. I showed them projections, not just for year 1, but for years 5 and 10. I demonstrated how the partnership would position Hartley Innovations as a leader in automated manufacturing. But most importantly, I revealed that I'd already closed the deal. I'm pleased to announce that Tanaka Robotics has agreed to a partnership with Hartley Innovations, pending board approval. The terms are already negotiated, and we can begin implementation within 60 days. The room went silent. Father's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. The board members leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "The initial contract is for $75 million over 3 years," I continued. "But the real value is in the exclusive distribution rights and technology licensing agreements. Conservative projections put the partnership value at over $2 billion within a decade." I clicked to my final slide, a side-by-side comparison of the Chen and Tanaka deals. "Both partnerships are valuable," I said diplomatically, "but I believe Tanaka offers more strategic advantage and long-term growth potential." When I finished, the room exploded with questions. Technical questions, financial questions, strategic questions. The kind of detailed interrogation that meant they were taking this seriously. I answered every single one, demonstrating a command of the material that shocked everyone in the room, especially my family. Father was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Mother's expression had gone carefully blank. Vanessa looked like she'd been slapped. After an hour of discussion, Father called for a recess. The board would deliberate and make their decision. As everyone filed out, Vanessa grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. "How did you do this?" she hissed. "You said you were struggling. You said—" "I said what you wanted to hear," I replied calmly, pulling my arm free. "Maybe you should have actually listened to my presentation instead of assuming I'd fail." Her face flushed with anger and something else. Fear, maybe. The sudden realization that the competition was real. Mother appeared at her side, her expression cold. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Claire," she said quietly. "One good presentation doesn't change who you are." "You're right," I said, meeting her eyes. "It doesn't change who I am. It just reveals who I've always been." I walked away before they could respond, feeling their stunned gazes on my back. The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they finally called us back in, Father looked serious. "Both presentations were exceptional," he said, "and the board has had extensive discussions about both opportunities." He paused, building tension. "However, we've decided that given the current market conditions and our strategic goals, the Tanaka partnership represents the better long-term investment." Vanessa made a small noise, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Therefore," Father continued, "I'm pleased to announce that Claire Hartley will be appointed Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately." The room erupted in applause. Board members congratulated me. Colleagues shook my hand, and I stood there, accepting their congratulations with gracious humility, while inside I was counting down the days until I destroyed everyone who'd tried to destroy me. This was just the beginning. The aftermath of my victory was everything I'd expected and more. Father was proud, genuinely proud, in a way he'd never been in my previous life. The board was impressed. My colleagues suddenly treated me with respect instead of pity, but the sweetest part was watching my family's reaction. Vanessa was devastated. She'd been so certain of her victory that the loss seemed to break something in her. She took a week off, claiming she needed time to process. When she returned, she was subdued, quiet, going through the motions of her VP of Public Relations role without her usual enthusiasm. Mother was furious but controlled, channeling her rage into passive-aggressive comments about how surprised everyone was how lucky I'd been, how different my presentation had been from my usual work. The implication was clear. I must have had help, must have cheated somehow. Let her think that. Let her investigate. She wouldn't find anything because there was nothing to find except my own meticulous work. Marcus predictably tried to swoop in and take credit. He called me days after the announcement, congratulating me effusively, reminding me how he'd encouraged me to pursue international partnerships, suggesting we celebrate with dinner. I'm really busy, I told him. New position, lots of responsibility. Of course, he said smoothly. But you still need to eat. Let me take you somewhere nice. We can talk about your plans. He wanted to get close again, to position himself to steal whatever I built next. I'll let you know, I said, and never called back. His texts became more frequent, more insistent. He was losing his grip on the situation, and he knew it. Good. As COO, I had access to everything: financial records, strategic plans, personnel files, Mother's charitable foundation accounts. I'd had most of this information already, but now I could access it legitimately without raising suspicion. I spent my first month in the role doing what everyone expected: learning the operations, implementing the Tanaka partnership, proving I deserved the position. But I also spent it building my case. Mother's charity fraud was even worse than I'd thought. She'd been siphoning funds for years, paying off people like Marcus, financing Vanessa's lifestyle, and pocketing the rest. The IRS audit I'd triggered was progressing slowly, but I had enough evidence to accelerate it dramatically. Vanessa's corporate espionage was well documented. I had logs of every file she'd accessed without authorization, every email she'd copied, every confidential strategy she'd leaked. I had proof that she'd stolen my work to close the Chen deal in my previous life, and I had proof that she'd tried to do it again in this timeline, only to find the files I'd planted were worthless. And Marcus was my masterpiece. I'd been documenting his fraud for months. The fake consulting contracts, the payments from Mother's Foundation, the elaborate scheme to steal my intellectual property. But I'd also discovered something new. He'd been running this same con on at least 3 other women, all daughters of wealthy business owners. He wasn't just a con artist. He was a serial con artist, and I had everything I needed to destroy him. The question was, when to pull the trigger? I decided to wait. 3 months to match the 3 months I'd spent setting the trap. 3 months for them to dig themselves deeper, to commit more crimes, to create more evidence. 3 months for them to believe they'd gotten away with it. During those 3 months, I transformed Hartley Innovations. The Tanaka partnership was already exceeding projections. I restructured our operations, implemented new technologies, and started building the empire I'd envisioned. I also started my own venture capital fund on the side, using my pseudonymous identity. I invested in every company I knew would succeed, building wealth that no one in my family could touch. By the end of month 3, I had $50 million in assets, completely separate from Hartley Innovations. I was untouchable, and then I struck. It started with the IRS investigation. The audit I'd triggered months ago finally escalated to a full criminal investigation. Federal agents showed up at Mother's Charity Foundation, seizing records and computers. Mother called an emergency family meeting. We gathered in Father's study, and for the first time in either of my lives, she looked rattled. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice tight. "Someone must have filed a false complaint. The Foundation's books are in perfect order." "Are they?" I asked quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. "What do you mean?" Father asked. "I mean, I've been reviewing the Foundation's finances as part of my COO duties," I said. "Making sure all of our charitable work is properly documented and compliant. And I found some irregularities." Mother's face went white. "You had no right." "I had every right," I said calmly. "The Foundation receives significant funding from Hartley Innovations. As COO, it's my responsibility to ensure that money is being used appropriately." "And," Father prompted, his expression grave. I pulled out a folder. I'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for this moment. "Mother has been embezzling from the Foundation for at least 5 years," I said. "Approximately $15 million has been diverted to personal accounts, fake consulting contracts, and cash payments to various individuals." "That's a lie!" Mother stood, her composure cracking. You're trying to frame me because you're jealous of Vanessa. I'm not framing anyone, I said, handing the folder to Father. These are the Foundation's actual financial records. I'm sure the IRS will reach the same conclusions. Father opened the folder, his face darkening as he reviewed the documents. Minutes passed in terrible silence. Patricia, he said finally, his voice like ice, is this true? I can explain. Is this true? Mother crumpled into her chair, tears streaming down her face. I was trying to help Vanessa. She needed opportunities, connections. Claire has always been so self-sufficient, but Vanessa needed support. So you committed fraud? Father's voice was shaking with rage. You stole from charity? Do you understand what you've done to this family's reputation? I did it for Vanessa, Mother sobbed. For our daughter. I'm your daughter too, I said quietly. Everyone went silent. I'm your daughter too, I repeated, louder now. But you decided I wasn't worth investing in. You decided Vanessa deserved everything and I deserved nothing. You decided to destroy me to build her up. That's not, Mother started. It is, I said, and my voice was steady, controlled. And I can prove it. I pulled out my phone and opened a file, one of many I'd been preparing. Here are emails between you and Vanessa discussing how to sabotage my work. Here are payments to Marcus Reeves, your hired con artist, whose job was to steal my ideas and undermine my confidence. Here are records of you poisoning me before the Chen Industries presentation so Vanessa could steal my work. You're insane, Vanessa whispered. This is insane. Is it? I looked at her. Tell Father about the Chen Industries presentation. Tell him who really did the research, who cultivated the relationships, who developed the partnership strategy. Vanessa's face crumbled. Tell him, I said. I had help, Vanessa said finally. Mother helped me. With research I'd already done, I said. Research you stole from my files after you poisoned me. Research that you claimed as your own. Father had gone very still. Vanessa, is this true? Yes, she whispered. But Mother said, I don't want to hear it. Father said, his voice terrible in its quietness. Get out, both of you, out of my house. Richard, Mother began. Out, he roared, before I call the police myself. Mother and Vanessa fled, sobbing, leaving Father and me alone in his study. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I'm sorry, Father said finally. Claire, I'm so sorry. I didn't see it. I didn't see what they were doing to you. I know, I said. They were very good at hiding it. How long have you known? Long enough, I said. Long enough to protect myself. He looked at me with something like awe. You played them. This whole time, you knew what they were doing and you let them think they were winning. Yes. Why not come to me sooner? Would you have believed me? I asked. Without proof, without evidence? Would you have believed that your wife and your golden child were conspiring against me? His silence was answer enough. I needed to let them incriminate themselves, I said. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Father nodded slowly. What happens now? Now Mother will be prosecuted for fraud and embezzlement. She'll likely go to prison. Vanessa will be fired and blacklisted in the industry. And Marcus, I smiled. Marcus will face charges for corporate espionage, fraud, and conspiracy. And you? I'll run this company, I said, the way it should have been run all along. Father stood and did something he'd never done in my previous life. He hugged me. I'm proud of you, he said, not just for what you've accomplished, but for how you've handled all of this. You're a better person than I deserve. I hugged him back, feeling nothing but the cold satisfaction of victory. 3 days later, Mother was arrested. The evidence was overwhelming. She was charged with embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Her bail was set at $2 million, which Father refused to pay. Vanessa was fired from Hartley Innovations and faced her own charges for corporate espionage. Her reputation was destroyed. No company in the industry would touch her. And Marcus? Marcus was the best part. The evidence I'd gathered connected him to 3 other similar schemes. He was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and identity theft. The combined evidence from all his victims meant he was looking at 20 years in federal prison. When the news broke, he called me. I let it go to voicemail. "Claire, please," his message said. "Please, you have to help me. This is all a misunderstanding. We loved each other, didn't we? You wouldn't do this to someone you loved." I deleted the message and blocked his number. I'd never loved him. I'd loved the person I'd thought he was. And that person had never existed. 6 months after my appointment as COO, Hartley Innovations was thriving. The Tanaka partnership had exceeded every projection. Our stock price was up 40%. We'd launched 3 new product lines, all based on innovations I'd developed. Father had officially named me his successor. When he retired in 5 years, I would become CEO. But I wasn't waiting 5 years to build my legacy. Using my venture capital fund, I'd been systematically investing in companies I knew would succeed. I'd built a portfolio worth over $200 million. I'd started mentoring other young women in business, helping them avoid the traps I'd fallen into. I'd also started dating, real dating, with people I chose, not manipulators my family planted. It was strange at first, learning to trust again, learning to believe that someone could want me for who I was rather than what I could provide. But I was learning. Mother's trial lasted 3 months. The evidence was so overwhelming that she eventually pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence. She got 8 years in federal prison. During the trial, she never looked at me. She never apologized. Even in her downfall, she couldn't admit what she'd done. Vanessa tried to reconcile. She called, sent letters, showed up at my office. She claimed she'd been manipulated by Mother, that she hadn't understood what they were doing, that she was sorry. I didn't believe her, but more importantly, I didn't care. She'd made her choices. Now she had to live with the consequences. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a small marketing firm, trying to rebuild her life from scratch. Marcus went to trial and was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. I didn't attend his trial. I didn't need the closure. I'd already moved on. A year after my COO appointment, I stood in my penthouse apartment, a much nicer one now, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. It was the anniversary of the night I'd stood Marcus up at dinner, the night I'd started my revenge. I poured myself a glass of champagne, Dom Perignon, the 2008 vintage, and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Mother was in prison. Vanessa was struggling to survive. Marcus was in a cell, probably still trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And I was here, successful, wealthy, and finally free. I thought about my previous life, about the woman I'd been. Desperate for approval, willing to sacrifice everything for people who'd never valued her. That woman had died in an intersection at 26, alone and heartbroken. But she'd also given me the greatest gift imaginable. A second chance. A chance to become who I was always meant to be. A chance to build the life I deserved. A chance to make them all pay for what they'd done. I raised my glass to my reflection in the window, to the woman I'd become. To rebirth, I said, and to revenge. The champagne was perfect. The view was spectacular. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was genuinely, completely happy. 3 years after my rebirth, 6 months before I would have died in my original timeline, I was named CEO of Hartley Innovations. Father retired to spend his remaining years traveling and finally living the life he'd always wanted. Before he left, he pulled me aside. "I have one question," he said. "How did you know? About Patricia? About Vanessa? About all of it? How did you know to protect yourself?" I smiled. Let's just say I learned from experience. He didn't push. Maybe he understood that some explanations were better left unsaid. Under my leadership, Hartley Innovations became one of the most successful companies in the industry. The Tanaka partnership transformed us into leaders in industrial automation. My other innovations and strategic partnerships pushed us into new markets, new technologies, new possibilities. My personal venture capital fund grew to over $1 billion. I used it to invest in companies led by women, by people of color, by anyone who'd been underestimated and overlooked the way I had been. I became known as someone who bet on the underdog, someone who saw potential where others saw failure. Because I knew what it was like to be underestimated. I knew what it was like to be dismissed, undermined, and sabotaged. And I knew what it was like to prove everyone wrong. 5 years after my rebirth, I was featured on the cover of Forbes. The article was titled, "The Phoenix CEO, How Claire Hartley Rose from the Ashes to Build an Empire." They didn't know how right they were. I had risen from ashes, the ashes of my own death, my own destruction, my own broken life, and I had built something magnificent from those ashes. Something that no one could take from me. Something that was mine alone. I never told anyone about my rebirth, about my knowledge of the future, about how I'd used that knowledge to destroy my enemies and build my success. It was my secret, my power, my gift. But sometimes, late at night, I'd think about that intersection where I'd died. I'd think about the woman I'd been, standing in the rain, stepping into the street, not looking, not caring, just wanting the pain to end. I'd think about how she'd gotten exactly what she wished for, an end to the pain. Just not in the way she'd expected, because dying had freed her. It had freed me. It had given me perspective, power, and most importantly, it had stripped away all the illusions I'd been living under. In my first life, I'd believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough, I would earn my family's love and respect. My death had taught me the truth. You can't earn what was never meant to be given. But you can take what's rightfully yours. You can build what you deserve. You can become who you were always meant to be. And you can make damn sure that everyone who tried to destroy you regrets it for the rest of their lives. I never saw Marcus again after his sentencing, but I heard he'd tried to write a book from prison. A memoir about how he'd been wrongly convicted, how I'd framed him. No publisher would touch it. His story was too obviously self-serving, too clearly the desperate lies of a con artist who'd finally been caught. Mother served her full sentence. When she was released, she was a broken woman. Older, frailer, completely stripped of the elegance and power she'd once wielded. She tried to contact me once, a letter asking for help, for money, for anything. I never responded. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. Vanessa eventually found some stability. She married someone ordinary, had ordinary children, lived an ordinary life far from the world we'd grown up in. I heard she was happy, or at least content. I was glad. Not for her sake. I still felt nothing but cold indifference toward her. But because her mundane happiness was a better revenge than any punishment I could have devised. Every day she would wake up knowing what she'd lost, what she'd given up, what she could have been if she hadn't tried to destroy me. That was punishment enough. As for me, I built the life I'd always dreamed of. I found love, real love, with someone who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. I had friends who were genuinely loyal. I had success that no one could deny or diminish, but most importantly, I had peace. Peace that came from knowing I'd won. Not just in business, not just in revenge, but in life itself. I'd been given a second chance, and I'd used it to become everything I was meant to be. On the anniversary of what would have been my death day, October 7th, the day my sister would have run me down in that intersection, I always took the day off. Not to mourn what had been, but to celebrate what was. I'd go to that same intersection and stand there, watching people hurry past, cars honking, life continuing in its chaotic way. And I'd think I was supposed to die here. I was supposed to end here, broken and alone, destroyed by people who were supposed to love me. But I didn't. I survived. I came back. I won. And then I'd go home to my beautiful life, my successful company, my true friends, and real love. And I'd be grateful. Not for the pain, not for the betrayal, not for the death that had started this all, but for the strength it had given me, the clarity it had provided, the power it had unleashed. They'd tried to destroy me once, they'd failed, and they would never get another chance. Because I wasn't the woman they'd thought I was, weak, desperate, easy to manipulate. I was the woman they'd made me, strong, strategic, absolutely relentless in protecting what was mine. I was the phoenix who'd risen from her own ashes, and I was never going to let anyone push me down again. That was my story, that was my victory, that was my revenge, and it was perfect.